Australian society. This is about the 36th mode of trying to record this, so I'm really hoping it works for you. I'm not quite sure what's happened, and part of it is my own stubbornness. This whole thing was planned around showing you a series of videos which Collaborate can't support, and it seems ridiculous that you can't see something that you should be able to quite easily see. And it doesn't really work when you have to pause and then go off somewhere else and have a look at it and then come back again. I think it's conceptually doesn't work. So this is our cultural diversity Indigenous Australian learners. It leads into childhood, but it also thinks a bit about gender. And I'm going to do you a second lecture after I've done this one, which is more of a, I guess, a history on the ground lecture. This is more of a talking through of issues and really to raise discussion with you, which hopefully, well, we'll see how the Collaborate goes on Wednesday. Okay, so it was planned to be given on Harmony Day, the 21st of March, and this is really what I wanted you to listen to this and then go and think about what is Harmony Day, why do we have it, for whom does it mean, and the language why does it mean is quite carefully chosen. It's asking why it is something that's come into being, and why does it have any particular meaning for us. And everyone seems to celebrate Harmony Day in quite different ways from observing my Facebook feed. So some schools wear orange. Everybody wears orange to school. Some schools dress up in their national dress, and so on. But I guess at heart that the idea is that we're celebrating a diverse Australia, not a migrant Australia, for reasons we'll think about today. But of course, if we're celebrating just a migrant Australia, then we're forgetting that our land was settled at the time that Captain Cook and his, for some discoverers, for others invaders, arrived on this land. And so Harmony Day really is an effort to bring together that complication and that conception of Indigenous belonging and new Australian belonging. And I definitely categorise myself within the new Australian, but also asking us to think beyond a white Australia policy, which, although imposed in the 1950s, still is really dominant today. Okay, so how many days really just one for you to think about, and to think about sort of why it's come into being and what it represents. Okay, and they should lead you into these discussion questions of what does an emerging community mean to you in an Australian context, and who and what is Australian, and that's the questions that really Harmony Day and consideration of Harmony Day brings up with us, and throws into question for us. So what I want to do in this recording is I want to go through a number of issues, but I've taken those issues very carefully and very specifically from 2016. The reason I have is I think that now we've had some time to think about them and some time to work through them, but also I think the issues that I'm bringing up from 2016 set an agenda for politics in 2017 that we're really thinking about still in 2018. And which has dominated this term of politics since the last election. So I've chosen them and brought them together, and I'm just going to go through them and raise some provocations and then leave you to think about them. I am going to show a number of videos. Some of them are quite distressing, so I just warn you of that before we go on. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was on the 25th of July 2016, Four Corners aired a programme called Australia's Shame. I'm wondering if any of you watched it or have seen it since then. It was about the Don Dale Youth Detention Centre, and it was about some allegations and some revelations that the programme had about the practices at Don Dale. It focused on inhumane conditions and suggestions of torture, and it focused most specifically on a small boy who had been first incarcerated at the age of 10. The footage caused outrage, horror, immediate causes for action, and the government response to this was a royal commission. So I'm just going to show you the beginning of the programme for you, of those of you who haven't seen it, and then I'm going to talk through some of the issues a little bit.
Extremely coarse language and distressing scenes.
Welcome to Four Corners. The image you've just seen isn't from Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib, but Australia in 2015. A boy, hooded, shackled, strapped to a chair, and left alone. It is barbaric. This is juvenile justice in the Northern Territory, a system that punishes troubled children instead of rehabilitating them, where children as young as 10 are locked up and 13-year-olds kept in solitary confinement. Most of the images secured by Four Corners in this investigation have never been seen publicly. They are shocking, but for the sake of these children who are desperate for the truth to be known, we cannot look away. Cara Meldrum-Hanna reports.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that there. So that was the opening for the Four Corners episode, which is really quite shocking. And as someone who used to work in juvenile justice, I found it quite hard to watch, not because it surprised me, but more because we used to do quite a lot and do anything to make sure our kids didn't end up in detention, because we wanted to set them on a path to rehabilitation, and it's really hard to do. So the show brought together a series of quotes which I've just put up there, which I've taken from their promo website. So this is barbarism, this is humane. We all sort of looked at each other of shocked. What's going on there with children in detention is deliberative, punitive, and a cruel policy. I'm not sure how many of you remember the airing, but people were really shocked the next day. They couldn't quite believe what they'd seen. And they also began to raise questions about, were we seeing something that we were surprised about, or was this something that really we've been doing to particular populations for a long period of time? It also raised questions around childhood, how we treat children, how we respect children, where children are placed within our society. And you can see just down the bottom, there's a comment: if I treated my children like that, the authorities would take my children from me quite properly, because I would be behaving cruelly to them. And there's another comment there from the children's advocate: they had absolutely nowhere to run. Those children were afraid for their lives. Those two comments indicate a new way of, a very humane way of thinking about children, that children have rights, that children should be subject to social justice, and that children should be protected by authorities. And what we were seeing in Don Dale, and I think this is where people were really horrified by what they saw, was that children weren't respected, that children's rights to be children were not respected, that children were confined in isolation rings, that the things that we connect with childhood, having the freedom to play, having the freedom to run, having the freedom to learn, and so on, being loved, being nurtured, being cared for, weren't happening in the detention centre, and the detention centres at their heart had been set up and were intended as places of rehabilitation, and there was no view to rehabilitation in those places. It was about control and putting people away. And so this challenges us on two levels. One was what's happening in our justice system, and to whom is it happening. One of the things that a lot of people commented on, they noticed, was that the boy who was being locked up was very white, and so it's questioning that this is something that's happening at a wider scale. The second thing that it raised is we believe that we fulfil all of the terms of the UN conventions, but to what extent are we doing so? And if we aren't doing it to some extent, then are we fulfilling the international conventions on the rights of the child? And the answer to that, probably watching a child being hooded in a spit hood, is no, we're not. But it also raised the questions, and you can see here, this is The Guardian the next day, not the next day, a few days later, where they raise questions around the Royal Commission, who should be commissioned to do it, and Pat Dodson starts to have a voice within this. And Pat Dodson starting to have a voice in this indicates that there's perhaps some questions that these practices have gone on. And there have been some criticisms coming out of the inquiry that it's only when we think that this is being done to our own children, without specifically being applied to a white population, that we begin to raise questions about what is happening. Okay, so the other response which came out very quickly to this, you can see one was published in New Matilda, which is an alternative publication. It came out just the next day, and Crikey, which is a left-wing critical paper, which came out 3 days later. They both said, this has been happening for ages, we've known about this, what are we also surprised about? So Crikey gives the opinion Australia has always kept its deepest, darkest abuses, out of sight. Britain sent its most undesirable people to far-off land to be tortured in secret away from British eyes. Is it any wonder that we have kept up the tradition? And so Nick Reinenberger comes up with the explanation that this way of treating people, and in particular, in this case, of treating children, is a legacy of our colonial heritage. It's been happening since we arrived. It's not a surprise. And New Matilda gives the same reaction. This has been happening. We've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing this to Indigenous populations. We are doing this on Nauru. And it's really not surprising at all. And so they link, actually, and they say the Four Corners report isn't the first time that this has been on the front of a newspaper. It's the first time that someone's paid enough attention to it to issue a Royal Commission. But on the 25th of September 2015, so almost a full year before the Four Corners report, on the 25th of July 2016, the Courier Mail had put on the front of their newspaper a headline, "Children Gassed." It said that the Northern Territory Children's Commissioner had released a report detailing shocking abuse of Aboriginal children in detention. So it was this newspaper item in the Courier Mail, the voice of Indigenous Australia, it tells us, which had led to the Four Corners investigation. And this report confirmed that there were tear gassing of juveniles at Dondale, and it was an overreach and an overreaction. So it's talking about continued abuses that are happening within that system. And at every point, it's raising questions about children and child, and really thinking to us and asking us to think about how we think it is, and if we think it is okay for children in our society to be treated in this way. So children come to the centre of this inquiry and this discussion. Okay. What I want to move along to is another debate that came up in the same year that is also around children. Ready for her yet? Never ready for her. So, in the same year, there were questions raised about the extent to which an Indigenous community in northwest Queensland could look after its own people, could look after its own children, the extent to which what was meant to be make this bigger, if that works, there we go, meant to be a self-sufficient community that was being allowed, is probably the correct word, to live in its own way, could look after its children, whether or not what we were seeing in that community was what we expected for the way that children were looked after. The community they're talking about is Orocoon, which some of you may, especially if you're in Queensland, it was in the papers quite a lot in the first half of 2016. So in 2016, there was violence in the township of Orocoon, where teachers were evacuated, and articles began to appear in newspapers with headlines such as "Orocoon, a failed social experiment." It was an Indigenous settlement which was the site of battles over governance, autonomy and land for decades. It was a contested site for bauxite mines, and it had been a mission up until the early 1970s, when it was converted into a township. In 1978, the Queensland government tried to take over the township of Orocoon, and there was an action by the Indigenous community to say that they had the capacity for self-management, and that was the way they would like to run their community, and that was given to them. Involved in all of this is the somewhat controversial figure of Noel Pearson. So Noel Pearson has always been involved in pressuring governments to give self-management to Indigenous communities. He doesn't believe in what he calls government handouts as a solution, and he believes that welfare benefits should be limited, and they're given to juveniles in Indigenous communities, and he said that they should be given to their parents until they're the age of 21, that children should learn, in his idea, the concepts of self-sufficiency. He's also asked us to think about one of the reasons that he refuses these is that they come from colonial institutions, and so we have to understand the complexity of our past, that the right to self-determination was already removed from a community, and in Noel Pearson's view, the giving of these benefits only increased dependency in the community that he served. So Noel Pearson is from northeast Queensland. He's from Cape York, and he suggested a number of solutions to the problems that Aboriginal communities were experiencing, including what one solution he set up, which is the Cape York Reform Welfare Trials, which aim to break social norms in that society through a tough-on-love approach to welfare. Okay, so he really believed that welfare shouldn't be given to people living in a community, but it should be given to agencies like his to self-manage. This isn't a new idea. This is a way that development has been done for a long time. And from the 1960s, those who were focused on, but in particular by the US government, as good development workers were also arguing that the funds for rehabilitation should go to them, not to the people, because the people would waste the money and they would invest them in good resources. So Noel Pearson's really just using the development speak he has already known, and which has been very successful. In Aurukun, he asked to take over a primary school, which in 2016 was operated by the Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy in a unique partnership with Education Queensland. The school looked after children from pre-primary, so from 3 all the way up to year 7. So when they finish, when they're 12 turning 13. Classroom instruction is dedicated to teaching mainstream curriculum in English literacy and numeracy, and controversially, Noel Pearson had chosen to use direct instruction. So most of our learning and our teaching in the classrooms, especially in the West Australian curriculum, is based on inquiry learning, and the Melbourne Declaration, as we know, has mandated inquiry learning as a way to teach. Noel Pearson said, no, we're not going to follow that, because for what he believed, for his group of children in far north Queensland, they just needed to get literacy and numeracy, and he believed that direct instruction, rote learning, was the best way for that community. So the other part of the curriculum was that children were also taught comprehensive Indigenous culture and language program, which gave them fluency in their own culture and allowed them to have a fully integrated curriculum. The school provided an extended school day with music, artistic and sports programs to give the children increased confidence and socially prepare them for moving between homelands, work and study in the wider world. So it sounds like a really great setup. It sounds like it's doing really interesting, really good things. Direct instruction, I think, is contestable, but Noel Pearson argued very strongly that he understood the needs of the community and that's what they needed. But in early 2016, we began to really question what was happening. And I'm not going to judge what happened in Aurukun in any way, other than to point out that people began to question. So violence broke out in the community, and it focused on the school. Teachers and the principal were threatened, rocks were thrown at their housing, and children as young as 6 tried to steal a car. The state government ordered the teachers to evacuate, and the school was closed down for 6 weeks. Which is really interesting. So at a time that you have social unrest, you have a school which works on direct instruction, so quite strict discipline goes with direct instruction. There's violence against the teachers, and the response is to shut down the school. To shut down the place that children are used to going to every day. The reports on what happened have been mixed. Pearson was defended the reputation of his school and the programs, and he claimed that the reaction to the Queensland government was knee-jerk and over the top. Other articles declared the failure of his program. 7 years of Noel Pearson trials have led Aurukun to the bottom of the national heap. Questions were directed at Pearson about his leadership and fitness to lead, and questions were raised about the legitimacy of his expenditure of state and federal funds. Pearson took what he said was a middle ground. He tried to teach a curriculum that spoke to 2 cultures, to foster a community that can span the 2 cultures. And he said that this was his undoing, that he was seen as misusing funds because he was using it to teach Indigenous culture. This was his claim. The questions about Pearson, the inability of Australian culture to bridge the divide, in fact he had to run 2 curriculums in his school, and the ability of Australians to identify a future that allows for this integrated curriculum really was brought into some redress at the same time as Woorabinda, a community south of Aurukun, was suffering the same problems. Teachers were under fire in the community. Teachers had their houses broken into. Teachers had their front fences set on fire, their cars hampered. One of the students I was teaching at this time was living in Woorabinda, and she was evacuated to a neighbouring town. And at the same time, the reports on Woorabinda were glowing. It was hailed as a community that was fully functioning and successful, and there were no reports in the papers on what was happening. The reason? Woorabinda had accepted the way that the Queensland government wanted to run its town. While Mel Pearson had argued for self-management of Arakoon, Woorabinda had accepted the rule of the Queensland government and had allowed the Queensland government to come in and run the community. And so Woorabinda was in the papers for having a booze ban, where Arakoon presented pictures of children playing in the rain, looking to some extent slightly neglected. And pictures also of police watching the background as two women throw punches at each other in the Queensland community. As if this violence and this neglect and this alternative way of living are everyday, and also perhaps limit the capacity of children to childhood. So both of these bring up questions around what expectations we have of childhood and the protections of childhood, what expectations we have of those who take over management of childhood. So Noel Pearson since 2016, we could talk about, but I'm going to base it just in this moment in 2016, because that probably makes it a more complicated story. But the story that we really want to focus on is, what expectations do we have for the childhood of these children and how they're protected, and how does that help us, or perhaps not help us, interpret what is happening in different communities? What is really interesting to me is that in the same year we have the Don Dale and we also have Arakoon. Both communities are raising questions about the extent to which children are protected and children are allowed to live, and that seems to be the way and the mode of engagement. I'm going to move to another issue which I think is related to this and which brings up different questions. I'm going to move to talk about Pauline Hanson. So Pauline Hanson is again a Queensland politician, and she is best known, and you can see the hashtag there, for her line "Please Explain." She joined the Liberal Party in 1995, and she went for Liberal Party pre-selection in 1996 for the successful election of John Howard. She was actually disendorsed at that election following racist comments, which and the way that we've always talked about this is that that John Howard allowed her to make these comments, and then sorry, I had to come through Facebook. There we are. Allowed her to make these comments, and then he distanced himself from her. So Hanson stood for a seat in Queensland in the Brisbane area, and she made her mark really. She's continued to make her mark by expressing racist views. When Howard remained silent for her racist views, he was pulled up in the press and asked if he disendorsed her ideas. When he eventually did respond, when Hanson made some really derogatory statements about minorities, and he cancelled her Liberal endorsement and declared that she would not be allowed to sit as a Liberal if she was elected. What happened with Pauline Hanson is she went on to win a seat in the lower house as an independent, and she was the first female independent to do so. So she was groundbreaking in some respects. In 1997, she founded the party that we now know as One Nation, as a right-wing, conservative, populist and anti-multicultural platform. Not sure that Pauline Hanson would support Harmony Day. She lost her seat in 1998. She fell out of favour, she was even expelled from her own party, and she made a comeback in 2013 when she rejoined the nation, and in 2016 she was elected to the Senate. So Hanson's quite well known for her maiden speech that she gave in Parliament on the 10th of September 1996 to the House of Representatives. In her opening lines, Hanson said, "I won the seat of Oxley largely on an issue that has resulted in me being called a racist. That issue related to my comment that Aboriginals received more benefits than non-Aboriginals." Hanson then asserted that Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians, her words not mine, and that these immigrants, I quote, have their own culture and religion, form ghettos and do not assimilate. Hanson argued that mainstream Australians were subject to, and mainstream Australians is her term again, and I quote again from her, a type of reverse racism by those who promote political correctness and those who control the various taxpayer-funded industries that flourish in our society, serving Aboriginals, multiculturals and a host of other minority groups, end quote. Called to respond to this maiden speech, Howard said she was entitled to express her opinion and that many others would share it, and that to denounce it would elevate it. This is an example of what's called John Howard's dog whistle politics, that he allows things to be said without directly endorsing them. Throughout his time as Australian Prime Minister, in particular in his fourth term, Howard was accused of communicating messages appealing to anxious and perhaps racist white Australian voters using code words such as un-Australian, mainstream and illegals. And one of the criticisms of Howard was it was seen that he took these terms and these words from Hanson, and so covertly expressed an agreement with her. The best example is Howard's government and the refugees. He took a tough stance on refugee arrivals, which was popular with voters, but the government was accused of using the issue to additionally send veiled messages of support to voters with racist leanings while maintaining plausibility and deniability and avoiding overly racist language. So Hanson, Howard, a decade before the issues that we see in Dundale and Aurukun, Howard, or at least through Hanson, are raising the question of those who take from our society without giving back. And two groups which are classified into that under Howard's politics are refugees and Indigenous Australians. And so I just want to have a look at her in the 2016 election, and you may have seen this already, and I apologise it was on Facebook, but I can't get it any other way, and they won't let me embed it either because SBS own it, so it comes from the SBS site, and this is during filming for Pauline Hanson programme on SBS.
My favourite topic, refugees. You're not going to tell me you're a refugee, James, are you? Really? I wouldn't have picked it. Good to see that you're actually taking up this and working.
Okay. Is that one of the most amazing pieces of telly ever? I think that we have Pauline Hanson make a comment on the extent to which she thinks a particular group will and can contribute to Australian society, that she sees working as what all people must do. They must return their debt to civil society by working, and that James, her Aboriginal interviewer, she can't quite believe that he's doing that. So Pauline Hanson's re-election raised a lot of questions and a lot of concern, and it raised a response from a large group of people who believed that Australians' racism problem is a growing emergency, who understood that the link that was made between refugees and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia was not only appalling but also represented an Australia that was becoming increasingly non-accepting of difference. So while Harmony Day is brought into being, at the same time politicians are saying it's okay to say no to difference. And so a number of articles appeared, particularly in, I guess, alternative sites, like Uni Batilda saying Australians' racism is a growing problem. Academics also responded to this, and I was a signatory to this. A large group of us wrote to speak out against what we saw as hate speech and racial intolerance in our society. We said, while freedom of expression is vital, what we had to think about was whether or not it was okay to have expression that incites hatred, that advocates and promotes discriminatory action, that allows groups to be pulled out, and maybe perhaps silently endorses discrimination against those groups, thinks that some people are more entitled to participate and to live in our society than others, which is not true. This happened at the same time as The Guardian launched a really amazing series of letters called Dear Australia. Dear Australia was letters from mostly children who had come through the immigration and asylum seekers, and these children wrote a letter telling us how they had come to belong. So I'm just going to show you this one here about Scovia and Zoa and Akor Delbai, and someone can tell me how to say that properly. They play at Aussie rules, so football, for the Butler Falcons, which is a suburb in Perth. Butler's just a relatively new suburb. Scovia came to Australia from South Sudan in 2003 on a humanitarian visa. And Akor's parents are also from South Sudan, and she was born in a refugee camp in Kenya before coming to Australia in 2004. And I'm just reading from the blurb, sorry, I should have told you this. Akor says the team has just become family to me when I play. It's like, oh, she's a refugee. It's not like, oh, she's a refugee. They just see me as another human being. So they really raise questions about what do you need to do to become part of Australia, and their way of belonging has been to stop playing football. So I'm just going to play a little bit from this, and then you can, if you want to watch all of it, because it's actually quite a good video, you can go back to The Guardian and watch it. Okay.
Oh, tackle! Judy, tackle! Where's that forward? You're going too much into centers. We have to restructure them.
When I first started with the Butler Falcons since 2013, I thought I'll just give it a go, and then after I just fell in love with it.
In 2013, I started playing because of the Butler Falcons. I wanted to do some sport, and there was a girls' AFL team. They've just become almost a family to me. People don't look at me different. That, oh, you play football? When I tell them that, they're just surprised, and it makes it easier to fit in, you could say. But I don't really mind standing out.
My family came to Australia in 2003 on a humanitarian visa.
My parents are from South Sudan, and then I was born in Kenya in a Kakuma refugee camp, and then we moved to Australia in 2004.
I've been able to pick up the game quickly because of the support around me. If you don't understand something, you can always turn to a player that plays for the same team or your coach, and they'll always help you out.
These girls train on Friday nights between 7 and 9 o'clock. And to get out there in the middle of winter at 7 o'clock and train all the way till 9 at pretty high intensity, they've really just taken the game on.
Yes, refugees do want to come to Australia and succeed. In my family's case, My mom is very proud, and yeah, we're Australian citizens now, so we're technically Australian.
Scovia has won the best and fairest of the Butler Falcon.
So I just want to pause it there. So that statement, we're technically Australians, raises questions about what does she have to do to become Australian? What is it that defines Australianness, and what are the limits of cultural diversity in Australia? Why does a child who arrived in 2004 still feel that she's only technically an Australian? What is it that defines Australian? And so these are the questions that were raised at the beginning about the limits of our civil society and the limits of belonging, and who and what can belong. So it's interesting to me about Scovia and Accor is that they've gone and they've picked the most Australian of sports, Aussie rules, which they're playing obviously very well. And they've founded a connection and identity with that, and that's made their place within their community. But they still feel this need to say technically Australian, and which to me as a migration historian raises the question of, if you bring an identity, you're meant to take off your old identity and leave that at the door when you come in. With Australia, with dual citizenship, to whom and to what extent is dual citizenship, the capacity to retain two identities, extended? Does it extend further than the British Isles? What we know is that both of those girls obviously had a very difficult path to get to Australia, and that question about who is allowed to enter and who can belong has been in our papers continually, especially in The Guardian, through the work of Eaton Fish, who has now been given asylum not by Australia, but by a nation in Eastern Europe. I'm not sure if any of you remember Eaton Fish and remember reading about him, but he went into conversation with First Dog on the Moon in The Guardian. It's a series of cartoons that they exchanged between them, and it became his voice within Australian society. He could tell us about the mental health problems that he was suffering in detention, being held on Manus Island, the abuse that he was suffering on Manus Island, the inability and the incapacity of the Australian government and those holding him to respond to his medical needs, and how Eaton Fish really felt that he was an Eaton Fish. He was no longer a person, and not treated as a person on Manus Island, which raises all these questions of belonging, and to whom and to what extent do we offer that right of belonging to people. So we've really now talked through three excluded groups, and a type of politics for exclusion which limits cultural diversity in Australia. And I want to bring that into some other context by having a look. This was from 2015, the previous year, that rapes and fears for safety on Nauru had been raised, that not only were people like Eaton Fish making it clear that he had undergone abuse, but also it was clear that women and children who were on Nauru were in terrible danger and had quite serious fear. And there was in 2016 the case in the paper of a woman who went to make a phone call, and while going to make a phone call, she was raped. And so the safety and the extent to which safety is offered to those who are judged not to belong, or who are waiting to be told that they can belong, is appalling. So also, I guess 2016 was the year of Rosie Batty. Rosie Batty was Australian of the Year in 2015, And we may remember Rosie Batty Rosie Batty's just announced her departure from Australian public life, but Rosie Batty is known for losing her son, who was Luke, who was killed by his father when he was playing cricket with his friends in a normal Australian suburban setting. Rosie Batty spoke out very quickly after the death of her son and the horrific death of her son, and she went on to become Australian of the Year in 2015 and to make a call for domestic violence to be put at the front of the agenda, and to make an argument that by refusing to address issues like domestic violence in our society, it means that we live in our greater network society in a series of abusive relationships. At the same time, Rosie Batty is making the call that recurs within all of the articles we've looked at today, which is to bring into question how childhood should operate, what values we give to our children, how children should be treated. And what Rosie Batty really raised questions about is we need to focus on how our children are treated when they're tiny to think about how they will be when they're older. So Rosie Batty raised a number of issues around mental health and protection of childhood, protection of women and those who are suffering in abusive relationships, and she did widen it out beyond women. She also looked at voice and agency and who is listened to and why. Okay, and she brings these issues up. So I wanted to just introduce Rosie Batty to have a look at the campaign which came about as a result of her, which you may remember from the newspapers, both from the newspapers, billboards, and also television, which was the "He just did it because he likes you" campaign. So in 2012, the ABS Personal Safety Survey found that 1 in 3 women in Australia will experience violence and 1 in 5 will experience sexual violence, which is really prevalent. That means that one of your neighbours on your street has suffered both of those things. One of your neighbours has suffered one of those two things and another neighbour has suffered another one. In 2015, the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women survey showed younger people had higher levels of attitudinal support for violence against women than older age groups. So it raises this question of why. Why were younger people thinking that violence against women was okay or was a norm? The most recent approach to combat violence against women was public education directed at children to motivate a change in our culture and mentality. And in Australia, the recent "He just did it because he likes you" example is an example. So the aim of the campaign was to go back to think about childhood, to think about what we normalise in childhood and how that impacts on our identity. So I'm just going to have a look at the television commercial and play it for you. I find it quite hard to watch, and then just talk through some of these issues.
Pop those down there. You're okay. He just did it because he likes you.
Don't try like a girl, mate. Come on.
Yes. You're okay. He loves you.
Violence against women starts with disrespect. The excuses we make allow it to grow. Violence against women. Let's stop it at the start. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Okay, So that's probably, I think, one of the more powerful campaigns that's been released. It was incredibly successful, and it did a really good job of reminding us and of bringing into being this idea of nurture and care within our society, and the reasons for it. That the experiences that children have as very young, at a very young age, imprint on them and determine the patterns for their later life. And so the extent to which we need to ensure as a society that not that childhood is protected, which has been some of the language used and as spoken about today, but that childhood is nurtured, that we think about the values and the attitudes that we as a society value and say that we value, and that we should instill in children. And also bringing, I think this what this ad does very well in this final scene, which you can see on the screen, is it brings into very close effect the experience that small boy has had at some point in his life that has shaped him as a man, but also that will continue to shape the children that these two people have, and to continue the same problems that we have in society. What a lot of these campaigns have done have brought into quite difficult commentary around the way that gender relations operate in Australian society, perhaps determine and sit, as we talked about in our gender lecture, sit as a power relationship within our society that determines our attitudes to other groups. And I just want to bring, because I like to stay in 2016, I think 2016 was an appalling year. It brought up many things for us. That around the same time as all of this had been the Eddie Maguire saga. I don't know if any of you remember it. It was pretty appalling. There was a radio program, Eddie Maguire had a radio program, and during a big freeze at the G event, I don't know if anyone knows what the G is, I had to go and look it up, where celebrities slide into icy water to raise money for motor neuron disease. Eddie Maguire said he would pay $50,000 to see another reporter, Caroline Wilson, held under the iced water, and charge an extra $10,000 for everyone to stand around the outside and bomb her. Eddie Maguire, they came back immediately to Eddie Maguire and said, you know what, that's endorsing violence against women in our society, and it's not okay. You're not allowed to say that. He defended himself initially, and he said, it's just humour, don't be so silly. Wilson, the victim of the comments, responded and said, this sort of sexist nonsense has long been an acceptable part of his occasionally violent vernacular, but I don't accept that it's jokey or banter. Sam Newman, who's an AFL commentator, used his platform on a Channel 9 programme to defend his friend Eddie Maguire. And Eddie Maguire then partnered up with Rosie Batty and apologises to Caroline. So it raises a number of questions about implicit sexism and gender violence within our society, and what are accepted as comments and what are accepted by very well-known people as okay things to say. Eddie Maguire doesn't like Caroline Wilson. Not only does he make it popular, but he says that it might be okay to hold her under ice-cold water. What does that tell us to those who are listening and watching? What does that tell us to the new refugees who have joined Australian society, who found that they really like AFL, and they begin to follow it and understand how our culture operates? What does it tell them about who we value, what we value, and the extent to which we accept comments like this? It's responded to by this person, Sam Newman. I felt like I was really un-Australian because I actually had no idea who he was before this. But he responded to it, and then Eddie Maguire had to make a formal apology to Caroline Wilson, and he did that by partnering up with Rosie Batty, and he said that it becomes quite a serious media campaign. You can see Eddie Maguire realised he had to fight for his job, but also his credibility. And so he said he's really sorry that the comments he made are at odds with his views, that he doesn't think violence against women is okay. And so he comes out and he makes this really public. In the course of all of this, there's an ABC question and answer time, and a young man in the audience, Tarang Chawla, asked a question. Sam Newman has courted controversy just yet again for defending Eddie Maguire for making a joke about drowning Caroline Wilson. I work as an ambassador for Our Watch White Ribbon and the Safety Steps Family Violence Response Centre. My sister Nikita was stabbed to death by her partner in January last year with a meat cleaver. She was 23. Male violence is a leading cause of death and disability of women under 45 in Australia. How will politicians and the media play a better role in bringing about long overdue cultural shifts so tragedies like what happened to my family are not normalised? So Tarang Chawla joined really the voice at the question and answer, and he says, you know, when do we change the way that we address people in our society? When do we change what happened? In the course of this discussion, one of the journalists, Van Badman, who you can see pictured here, was called hysterical. I'm just going to see, pretty sure. I'm just going to play this for you. Hopefully, when it starts.
I happen to know all of the people you mentioned, Sam, Eddie and Caroline Wilson very well. And Eddie apologised immediately.
Sorry, I should have said that this is the response to the question raised by Chawla.
If you listen to that broadcast in context, it was a bunch of blokes laughing about things that they shouldn't have laughed about. But I think too much was made of what was originally a joke on a football show.
What you see as, you know, jokes made by a bunch of blokes, you know, from the position of being one of those blokes who's probably been in on some of those jokes, I see as a woman who is part of a social world where, you know, violence is...
I hope you're not suggesting I've been on. You know.
I'm saying
Look,
that
I'd like you just to
you are
retract that,
creating...
because I would never
I'm saying that you have just described them as a bunch of blokes joking around and,
That's
you know,
a fact.
making apologies. Yes, Steve.
That's a fact.
Yes,
That's what they
Steve.
were doing.
Yes.
Well, don't
But
tar
it's
me
not-
with their brush.
It's not.
Please.
It's not funny.
Don't tar me with their brush.
Steve,
Please.
Steve, do you know what you're doing? Do you have any understanding what you're doing? This man has given us an extremely upsetting story about something that's happening,
I can hear
and
as
you
well as you
are
can.
defending yourself in a context where we have to have a conversation about cultural attitudes that treat women differently. And you cannot create paradigms where there are
I just
blokes
don't
who
want
have
you to
this
twist
kind of
stories when you
behaviour,
shouldn't.
and we are
Just
looking
because
at
you're a
women
woman, you're not
who
the only
live
person who can get upset
in the
about it.
result of cultural attitudes that treat women differently.
Men can
And
be
this
just
is
as
the
upset about
situation.
these
Steve,
things
can,
as anyone else.
well, I'll give you a
Steve?
chance to respond in a moment, but
Thank you. You're proving my point very excellently about the attitudes that create this kind of conflict.
Okay, don't leave that there, but in the course of that conversation, Steve says, well, you're hysterical. What Van Bellen comes back to and says, I'm still reeling from the Q&A, but not because I was called hysterical, but because despite the controversy that has gone on, Steve and people like him can still not see that their behaviour, their tacit endorsement of casual sexism in our society has no effect and no relationship to violence against women in our society. So she sees and she agrees with the comment from Chawla, which his horrific story of his sister, and she agrees and she says, you know what, it is cultural shifts that are needed, and it is normalisation of comments made by those people like Eddie Maguire that allow for the perpetuation of that in society. This is very much the same argument that's being made about the comments that are allowed around casual racism. That all of these comments together create much larger cultural problems and problems to do with lack of diversity, lack of equality, lack of equity within our society, and a lack of recognition that all people have equal rights to belonging and to contributing. I just wanted to finish with this. So, in the context of all of this, The Guardian ran a comment section where someone wrote in and said, "You look good in a tight skirt. Can he say that to me at work?" So here it is. I once had a job interview which went really well. I got the job and have since changed workplaces. But the next week, when I was at my now formal work, I said to my boss, one of the questions I got asked during the interview was, what positive things would my co-workers say about me, and what do you think is one of my positive aspects? He replied, well, you look good in a tight skirt. This is from Jane, a receptionist from Sydney. And so it was these instances of why you dress like you work in a strip club, how can you be a sculptor where you have to live hefty materials, so women can't be sculptors. You can always tell them you're female when they're when she makes a mistake at university, and so on. That and the first one is just appalling. Then about the Moulin Rouge dancing, which is from a public servant in Western Australia. So the questions really here are around, what do we accept? What do we allow to be said within our society? What isn't okay to be said in our society? Where are the limits of okay and not okay? And how do everyday comments like you look good in a tight skirt impact on what we see is okay and what we see is not okay, and then on the extent to which our society becomes inclusive and allows equal rights for those who seek to join our society, that doesn't just award those who conform completely to the rules of our civil society. And I'm not saying that these girls are. I actually think playing football is amazing. I've never played football. I don't think I'd have any ability to do so. But those who perhaps push at the boundaries of what we see as being acceptable and as of ways of protecting and looking after children in our society, and of how childhood should be treated and protected in our society. They're all really controversial issues that go back to those first questions about what does imagined community mean to you? So what and who comprises your Australia? What and who is Australian? What are the limits of our civil society? And how, and I think this is the challenging bit, as a teacher, do you begin to critically engage with these ideas so that your students also begin to help change those cultural norms of who and what is given the right to belonging in our society, which goes back to the place of Harmony Day in schools, which can often be overlooked as like another ridiculous celebration that we have to have, and another quite stressful activity that the poor teacher has to do, but which really uphold a quite important social function. And hopefully what some of these examples have done, in particular the last one around the Sam Newman, Caroline Wilson and Eddie Maguire controversy, bring up is how implicit and explicit it is in our society, a tacit acceptance of the judging of the right of some people to speak over others, as happened on the Q&A with Van Badman, for others, and to judge what others need and should have, and the extent to which we are ready as a society to deal with some of the problems which are endemic and come about as a result of particular cultural norms and attitudes, and perhaps if we shift our gaze and we might be able to deal with some of these wider social issues, which someone like Rosie Batty has very successfully helped us to do following the tragic death of her son Luke. Okay, I'm going to leave that there because I'm not sure if you could hear my children shouting in the background. I'm really sorry if you could. I don't know how to stop this, so let's hope that I work out how to edit it so that I can stop it. This is really embarrassing. Okay. Right, goodbye.